Georgian Parliament. I'm not sure how you say welcome in Georgian, but you're very welcome, and I hope you enjoy our session. Today is our second second session into our inquiry into planetary health, and we're going to be looking at food systems. Can I ask the panel to introduce themselves from my left, starting with Professor Godfrey?
My name is Charles Godfrey. I'm Director of the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University, and I lead the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Food.
I'm Claire Heffernan. I'm the Director of London International Development Centre. I'm a Chair at the Royal Veterinary College, and I have a joint appointment with London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Philip Thornton. I work for CGIAR, hosted through the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, although I'm actually based in Edinburgh. I lead a flagship programme on climate change, agriculture and food security. That's one of the research programmes of the CGIAR.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask you all to sort of tuck your chairs in and sit forward and project so we can hear you, so that the mics can pick you up? The sound's okay, isn't it? Thank you. Perhaps we can. I can make a start. With you, Professor Godfrey. I mean, what do you think is the likely impact of environmental change on food systems globally, and what should policymakers be doing? What should we be doing about it?
So there are many ways that environmental change will affect food systems, and obviously one of the greatest is climate change. We still don't know exactly what those effects will be. But modelling that we've done in Oxford suggests that by mid-century there could be of the order of 500,000 deaths that would not otherwise have occurred because of climate change. I wouldn't want to defend that particular number in great detail, but I think it is significant at an order of magnitude.
If you mean excess deaths? Is that an excess deaths number?
Yes. By mid-century, fewer people will be dying of diet-related diseases, largely because people will be getting more wealthy. So there is an underlying good news story. People come out of poverty, they're able to afford better diets. Yet that progress will be held back by climate change of the order of, again, the model suggests about 500,000. I think more important than the headline number is to boil down to try and see where that comes from. And climate change is likely to affect food production, is likely to work through the economic system to make food more expensive. So the good things that happen as people come out of poverty will be slightly ameliorated by increases in the price of food. One of the areas where we're actually least certain about the model, and that's, I think, one of the valuable things that comes out of an exercise such as that, is the role of fruit and vegetables. The clearest evidence we have epidemiologically is that fruit and vegetables are very good for our health, and we worry in particular about the effects of climate change on fruit and vegetables, that they'll be harder to grow, that they'll be more expensive, and that people will eat less of it with the effects on the environment.
Okay, thank you. Professor Heffernan.
I think that we need to understand the context to answer that question. And I think if we know that agriculture by 2050 will need 50% more food than was grown in 2012. We know that 2/3 of the global population will live in urban areas. And we know that by 2100, of the 11 billion people that populate this planet, 9 billion will be in Africa and in Asia. So that's kind of the forthcoming context. I think if we look at food production today, 60% of agricultural land and 80% of the world trade is focused in the G20 countries. And the livestock sector often offers a very good example. I think if we look at 2012, there was the top 12 countries, which were Northern and BRIC, produced 70% of the total global product. Africa produced less than 10%. So we have this emerging disparity in where food is going to be able to be produced. And I think how that will show up, I think in the short term, we know that we're going to see an increase in some crops that are sensitive to carbon dioxide, they'll increase in yields. I think in the medium term, we know that things are going to happen to the world's rangelands, and we're not quite sure what that's going to be. This notion of an unstable savanna where trees go into the rangelands and make them less of a carbon sink.
What's a rangeland?
Oh, there's 40% of the world is covered in rangelands. They're basically areas of the world where livestock are really only suitable to livestock. They're grassland areas. So I think in the longer term, and this is around 2100, and this is my opinion, I think we'll be seeing just this transfer of food from north to south. I don't think we'll be able to see, I think food growth will be in temperate countries. So that's my kind of vision of what I think will happen and what we need to prepare for. And which countries
do you think will be particularly affected or
most
vulnerable?
I think India is a very good example of a very vulnerable country. I mean, they predict that the water will be, groundwater sources of India are going to dry up by 2050. That's not very long away. The whole dairy industry in India is based on smallholder farmers who depend on that water. So that's a whole continent where the dairy industry, I think, will look fundamentally different. And what we're doing now, what's happening now to protect these animals against climate change is you're seeing this increase in infrastructure. So you're seeing the rise of the air-conditioned dairy barn in India. And clearly that's unsustainable. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to think about in terms of global food systems.
Dr. Thornton, I mean, do you think there's going to be spillover effects that will affect sort of social stability, leading to conflict, migration? What do you think is going to happen?
I think very much so, and just to underline what Charles mentioned, I think we are starting to see, and the models are becoming a little better at projecting some of these more, if you like, hidden effects of climate change. When we think of climate change, we tend to think of sort of long-term changes in mean temperature, for example, or changes in rainfall amounts and patterns, and all of these things, of course, can have a big impact on length of growing period, growing seasons, for example. But then there's a lot of projections that are suggesting that there's going to be increases in climate variability into the future. And in general, these are things, this whole issue around sort of increased frequency of extreme heat events, for example, increasing floods, increasing droughts. These are things that are not very well captured yet in our models of what's likely to happen. So I think many people would believe that we're actually somewhat underestimating what some of the effects of climate change may be on food systems in the coming years. I think the models are getting better, that we're starting to be able to look at some of these changes in the future. But for example, by 2060s, 2070s, if we carry along on the sort of current greenhouse gas emission trajectories, we may be seeing, if we get to the stage of seeing, for example, plus 4 degrees of temperature shift, then even without the climate variability effects, then that means agriculture, rain-fed agriculture south of the Zambezi will essentially disappear. And so then the question is, well, are there ways that we can help smallholder farmers, even commercial farmers, to adapt to those kinds of circumstances? So I think the spillover effects are potentially very large.
Professor Godfrey.
You also asked about possible policy responses to this, and I wonder if I can just sort of sketch three. One is very broad, which is everything that we can do for climate change will have very positive effects on the food system. Within the food system, the issue about converting land, especially tropical rainforest and other forests, to agricultural land. I think Lord Stern said a few years ago the most efficient way to get carbon dioxide into the environment was to cut down rainforests. So there's some clear things we must avoid doing there. I think as we think about the mechanisms for reducing carbon emissions, in the past agriculture has been left out as too hard a sector to include, and I think that's untenable going ahead, given it's a sector that produces 30% of greenhouse gas emissions if one includes land conversion in that. I think specifically within the food system, one has to look at issues around adaptation, and I think there are many things that can be done there. One is around the genetics of crop and livestock breeding, and in the past we've rather concentrated on just one aspect, increasing yields. I think increasing resource efficiency, increasing resilience is going to become increasingly important. I think one has to look at the labour component of agriculture as well. And as both my colleagues have said, that some of the issues about labour functioning in an environment that is going to be more challenging for people working. It'll be impossible in some areas, but where it's marginal, then I think one has to look at that. And finally, an area which I think is extremely important and something that might be the first area where climate change affects the food system is the increased frequency of rare events. And we saw a little bit of this in 2008, 2010, when there was major volatility in food prices. But actually, well within what is possible to happen, one could get much greater volatility through a combination of bad harvests in a couple of areas, possibly with, you can imagine a scenario where one also has, for example, an area of at-rest. So I worry about these sort of multiple things happening at the same time. If one looks in particular at sub-Saharan Africa, where over the last couple of decades one's seen these enormous megacities, which at the moment have to be fed to a large degree from global commodity markets. In the future, hopefully indigenous agriculture will be more important. To me, one of the things that keeps me awake at night is the resilience of the global food system. It's largely commercial companies doing it, and it may absolutely be fine, but I would like to see the ability of the global food system to respond to a multiple breadbasket failure, to be stress tested at this stage, to have a conversation with the global commodity traders, the type of conversation one wish one had with the banks in the early 2000s.
Thank you. Caroline.
So the picture you're painting is really scary. I mean, it's a real wake-up call, I think. But I was surprised slightly that in the response to what we should be doing, you didn't mention, as far as I heard, the fact that we feed around a quarter of the world's grain to animals. And I wondered if you would say anything about our dependence on meat-based diets in particular.
Shall I go first on that? I was sort of concentrating particularly there on climate change, but on broader things that I believe have to be done on the food system. There's waste, which I won't go into detail because that's so obvious. I think globally we have to eat less meat, but I wouldn't want to be accused of demonising meat. So the two caveats on that is that, and Phil Thornton's an expert in this, in developing countries there are many communities which rely on meat, and one wouldn't want to say the type of dietary change we have to do in the rich world would apply to them. And secondly, I think if we've learnt nothing from the political upheavals of the last couple of years, it's really important to understand who are going to be the losers in this area. Much of livestock production in the rich world is on the economic margins at the moment. So I think we need a narrative that involves a reduction in the consumption of meat that does not generate a large political caucus that will argue against it. Now, I think there are interesting ways that can be done that, but that's a challenge as much in the political sphere as in the research sphere.
Look forward to that conversation at some point. Sounds interesting.
What do you think are the ways that you could do that?
I beg your pardon?
You said there are ways of doing that. What are they?
If you look at many of the livestock farmers, they are farming in areas which can produce public goods.
Okay,
those public
so the
goods,
whole storing
Yes.
soil, peat, bog restoration. Okay, we've written the report on that, so we'll move on. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Chair. If I may, I'd like to move on to planetary health and population health. We heard from previous witnesses that the environmental damage is now affecting human health and prosperity, and Howard Frumkin explained that the trends in the Earth's systems pose grave threats to human health and well-being, affecting every category of health outcome. So in your opinion, Professor, what will be the effect of environment change-induced charges in food availability on population health, and what will be the effect in the UK in particular?
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
First on that? As I mentioned earlier on, our modelling suggests that some of the most major effects will be on the consumption of fruit and vegetables, and also restricting people from coming out of calorie hunger. So just as food is more, people are largely hungry because they cannot afford food. if you put on one side people in conflict zones. And if climate change makes food more expensive, fewer people will come out of poverty, and so would be the effects on them. I'm more sanguine about the UK because I think we spend 9% of our income on food, which historically is probably at no time since money was invented has a society spent less on food than we do at the moment. So I'm sanguine largely, but I worry about the bottom decile of the income cohort in this country. And then I think the interesting question is, does one ensure that they're okay by working within the food system, or does one use other safety nets to bring those people out of poverty so they can afford food?
What are these safety nets, and you have to expand that a wee bit, I think.
By the safety nets, I mean safety nets through social security and other broader things outside the food system.
Getting on the step.
Yeah.
Could you come on that, please?
We need to produce more food in the UK. We're very dependent on imports. But the problem is we've lost, I think, from 2000 to 2013, 22,000 small farms have gone out of business. So we're underpinning our food system is very, very insecure. The average, I think, earnings of a farmer in 2017 was about £33,000. This is not a stable system of producing. From small-scale farmers are much more sustainable than large-scale intensive systems. And what we're seeing in the UK is this switch over into large-scale intensive livestock systems, certainly. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of protecting these communities and supporting these communities in climate mitigation and adaptation to enable them to continue to produce food. Because the future, northern food production, in my opinion anyway, is going to be what is the breadbasket of the world. We need to keep farmers working.
Yeah, I love the aspect that you're taking on communities, because everything about a whole sustainability is all dependent on communities working and talking and supplying food, as we know, to each other. If you could like to comment, please.
Yes, I think from a global perspective, in order to be able to feed the planet, we're looking at the estimates vary, but by the middle of the century we're going to need maybe 70% more food than we produce at the moment globally. As we've heard from climate change effects, there are many countries and communities, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, that are going to be extremely hard pushed to increase food production in a sustainable manner. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that most of the farmers in the world, particularly in the developing countries, something like there's a large amount of food is produced in the rural areas on very small farms of 2 hectares or less. And in terms of looking at how the future may unfold, it's unlikely that many of those smallholder farmers they're not going to disappear. You have quite a lot of urbanisation happening, but what tends to happen is that the people moving into the cities are men primarily, and so in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the people doing the farming in the rural areas are women. And so this makes this adds, if you like, to the challenges of how is it possible, or how can we help smallholders in the rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, who are primarily women, how can we help them to intensify their production in a sustainable manner? And so I think when you're looking at that from the developing countries side, there are many issues, many challenges that need to be dealt with.
Yeah, thank you very much. It sounds like we're adding to the complexities even more than probably one of these unintended consequences. Probably seen this before, but could I ask you, how aware of climate risks to food security are the UK's population and in particular the political leaders? Maybe for Professor Clare to answer that. Are we taking this seriously enough?
I think there's a lot more that we can do. I think there's certainly within the livestock sector, although it's very heartening. I recently received a communication from the British Veterinary Association on they're launching a report on sustainability issues that veterinarians should be responsible for. So there is movements within the sector, to look at sustainability in a different way. So I think that's very important. But no, much more can be done. A lot more can be done.
Perhaps I should say I have the privilege of chairing DEFRA's Science Advisory Council, and this is something that we have talked about, and I know that this is an area that DEFRA are working on and are considering.
Well, working on and considering leaves me a wee bit kind of dubious about what they're actually going to produce. I mean, we're in 2019, we're hearing about all climate changes, and you'd think we would have something produced by now, what if there's going to be an action plan. It's, I would say it's got to be here very soon.
Yes, there are elements of it in the 25... I should say I'm not here to defend DEFRA, I'm an external on it, but there are elements of this in the 25-year plan for the environment.
Elements of this in the 25-year plan. Just to go back to the devolved parliaments, do you think there's differences in awareness? Are you aware of any differences in awareness between the devolved administrations and the UK administration? Can you answer any of that? Are you aware of the differences, for example, in the Scottish Government, how we take these things maybe perhaps more serious than the UK government? Is that getting you political?
I'm not certain about that, but one comment I would make is, and I'm on a committee in Scotland called Recess, and I'm afraid I can't remember what that stands for, but I tremendously admire some of the work that is going on in the James Hutton Institute in Scotland.
Yeah.
And in particular, it's focusing on crops such as barley, raspberries, where there are particular issues in Scotland. I know they're looking at climate change, and I know they're also looking at other places around the world with similar climates. So there is very fine research going on in Scotland. I can't say about the political side.
Do you wish to comment on that?
I would say, in terms of the awareness, again, if I may talk about smallholder farmers in parts of the world where I interact with them sometimes in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, I think that the awareness of what's happening is very real. Even for people who are not necessarily farming sort of as a full-time livelihood, many people are connected to the land. And many people also realise that if they're farming, they're not able to do it in the way that their parents did it or that their grandparents did it. In other words, they're seeing quite a lot of changes in the environment within which they're trying to produce food. And so they're very aware of what's happening, perhaps in a way that we in some of the higher income countries, many of us are not so connected to the land, either culturally or physically. And I think that's something that, as Charles mentioned before, I think there's a lot more work that could be done around trying to raise this awareness and show. I mean, a lot of people aren't aware of where food comes from, even in some communities. And I think there's a lot that could be done through, for example, social media for communications, even through gaming or through scenarios, particularly in ways to engage the youth. And this is something that we're trying to start to take very seriously, particularly as I mentioned, this issue of depopulation of the rural areas. How can we make farming in all places? How can we make it economically attractive so that will encourage people to stay on the land and stay connected and produce food in a sustainable manner? I think these are issues that we really need to address.
I think the issue for policymakers is we need the right information at the right time, and the evidence base is often very disjointed in this field. And so I think at a policy level, we need much more synthesis about different areas of research to identify best practice and the best way forward. And I don't necessarily see that happening, although there are moves and there's a variety of different groups that are coming together and offering kind of opinion pieces. But so that's where I think you could get much more value for what's going on. We need to link up the research.
Can I just ask one more question?
Very quickly.
I just wanted to comment on the Hutton Institute, because they produce seed potatoes that go to all of these countries from all over the world. They grow them there, and these seed potatoes are sent to South Africa and all the world to grow in that particular soil. And the problem with Brexit could be that these seed potatoes have to be transported at a certain temperature. And if there's a breakdown in the communications and the ferry terminals, these people will lose what you're actually trying to achieve, is keep these people on site to grow, and it could all break down, and it's extremely worrying for everybody. And in Scotland, it's 80 to 100 million pounds a year of an industry, and it's world renowned. So thank you for bringing that up and remembering me to mention that.
Thank you. Of course, we have the world's collection of rhubarb in Wakefield, so I think I'll just put that in. And the rhubarb season is shortly to be upon us, and there will be a festival in Wakefield to celebrate those things, along with the licorice festival in June. However, Alex had a question.
Supplementary to Philip, the one thing that's picked up was very interesting. You said that we need to engage youth. I assume you meant urban youth in these matters. You talked about gaming. How would do you see that operating? Would you talk about farm simulators? How do you think that would work in urban youth understanding, agriculture better through gaming or technology?
Yeah, I have a couple of colleagues who are working on this in some university departments, but that's right. I mean, with mobile phones, so rather than having people play games, sorry, I'm not very well up on this, play whatever it is they're playing, people are starting to develop some of these sort of simulation games. So just try to get the ideas across to young people who may not have been exposed to sort of agricultural food systems in the past. And also getting people to understand some of the very difficult trade-offs that have to be made between, say, profit maximisation or being farming in a sustainable way or doing it in a low-carbon way. So I think there are real opportunities there, and not only in higher-income countries, but in Kenya, that I know quite well. Mobile phone penetration is now something like 95% in an incredibly short span of time. And so, as many of you probably know, there's basically an informal banking system that's based on mobile telephony, and also there are now a couple of big projects set up to provide farming information and climate information services to farmers in the rural areas. And so when you have that kind of infrastructure, it would be, I think, be very interesting to set up games that would try to help to engage the youth into the whole agriculture and the food system.
Great, thank you. And can we welcome the Georgian delegation, who I believe has now arrived? You're very welcome. And sorry, I thought the ladies in the corner, but obviously, no, you're all British. No, we don't speak Georgian. I don't know how to say welcome in Georgian, but you're all very welcome here. Philip.
Thank you. Yeah, could I just remind the committee of my farming interests in arable livestock and potatoes in this country? And Professor Heffernan, I'd just like to pick up a comment you were making. I'm going to talk about UK trade policy in a second, but you said that we need to increase in the UK the proportion of food produced here in order to meet demand and reduce reliance on exports. But you also said that farming sustainability of the small farms is a problem, and it is a problem, but the problem I don't think is to be found in increasing the number and range of small farms, because, as you pointed out, the number of farmers has declined significantly over the last 15 years or so. But that's because of the inherent lack of profitability and viability of small farming. So I don't quite understand how you think increasing small farms is going to help increase food production, which I think was what you were trying to indicate.
Yeah, I think that small farms, in terms of climatic impacts, are more sustainable than large-scale intensive food systems.
But how do they produce more food?
No, absolutely, they don't. They don't produce more food. But you have a collection of farmers that are able to be, for example, dairy farms. You've lost a huge amount of dairy farms. I think the small farming sector should be supported. I think the cost of inputs is extremely high, and this is what's forcing people out. So yes, there is an economic viability argument. They're not economically viable. Half of their income comes from EU subsidies. That's not economically viable. So essentially, we're going to let these food-producing groups and people who know how to produce food go under. And I think in the long term, that will not benefit this country. I think there has to be better ways to train farmers, to make them more profitable, to enable them to participate in adaptation and climate change mitigation activities, and to make money out of it. I think the farming system has to change, but in doing that we need to support these farmers and not just let them disappear.
So are you arguing for more subsidy or higher food prices?
I'm arguing for a better trained sector with the average age of a farmer now is 55, I think. It could be slightly higher. We have to attract young people into this sector. I think we have to look at it holistically, from education to training to kind of production systems, how we can make these production systems more financially viable for these farmers. That's what I'm arguing.
So, Professor Coffey.
I guess I take a slightly different perspective, that a problem we have in the rich world is that with our labour costs, it affects the financial viability of farming. And in different places and different worlds, we've come up with different solutions, most of which are imperfect economically, whether it's in the States, whether it's in Europe. I think, irrespective of what happens politically in the next couple of years, there are opportunities to try and do it better. My view is to be clearer about what we are paying for, and that schemes such as single farm payment are a silly way of doing it, because most of a huge amount gets turned into land prices. And without opening subjects you've dealt with beforehand, I am very much in favour of going to a more incentive, putting money to rural companies by incentives for producing something. And I think a corollary of that is that we need far greater geographical granularity in how we do it, so that there will be some areas which at the moment are largely small, especially as Claire was saying, small dairy farms, where one asks them to produce other things, and again, the public goods and such. And I see that if one could get that right, one would end up with a more granular agricultural landscape, with perhaps fewer constraints on the highly profitable farmers and more money going into the areas that are not profitable and where we make a decision to maintain communities for social, environmental or other reasons.
Such as upland areas producing livestock because they can't produce anything else?
Yes, although I would say that one has to draw the boundaries quite wide and say they can't produce anything else within agriculture. But if you look more broadly at public goods, then they could be sequestering carbon, they could be providing homes for biodiversity, they could be providing recreation, and that we need a mechanism that we can actually pay them for doing that. And what's more, we need to change...
But neither of those two alternatives would increase food supplies in this country, which I think was the point that we were driving at.
Yes, so I am not sure that food supplies within this country should be a primary goal of policy. My view of food security is that the policy goal of food security is that we should have a farming system that so if there is a food security issue, then the first effect of that will be an increase in prices. The farming community, just by Economics 101, will respond to that. I think that where there are possibilities for market failure and where policy should come in is to make certain that that response to the market signals are efficient. And I'd say efficient in two ways. First, economically, and that goes into providing the human capital, social capital, so that we have a highly professional farming system that can respond to price signals. And I'd also say environmentally efficient as well, because were we to have to produce more food from this country because of price signals going up, we need to do it in a way that won't undermine our capacity to produce food in the future.
Just to add to that, I think there's two countries, Spain and the Netherlands, and I'm not sure you might have been over this, that supply 69% of the fresh veg in the UK. That's a very risky scenario. There's 4 countries that produce 44% of the fresh fruit. Again, so we have to be very careful if we're not producing our own food, where we're getting it from, and that puts a variety of different stresses on food systems. So that would be something if I were a decision.
No. Hold on.
Sorry.
Caroline.
Well, I was a bit shocked by Professor Godfrey's response about not being that bothered about food security in this country. Surely everything that you've just described to us shows us a more dangerous world where there's going to be even less ability to depend on sustainable exports into the future, and therefore working out how we can produce more in a sustainable way here at home surely would be the first step in trying to build our own resilience.
I guess I do think about the food system as globalised. I very much follow commentators such as Stieglitz who say the food system is globalised. The real challenge is not to reverse it, but to get it to work for the public and to work especially for the poorer sections. I think if one was a food minister in Egypt or Singapore, countries that will never feed themselves, then talking about food sufficiency, well, it's just so important we have a globally efficient and working system. And I do see we have a role in that, but the role I see is that we can respond efficiently in the two dimensions that I said to increase global stresses for
Increasing
food.
our own resilience isn't incompatible with ensuring that there's greater global resilience. Surely that those two things are working
Yes.
in the same direction. If we are taking less of the food that would otherwise be needed to go to somewhere like Egypt, which for whatever reasons isn't able to produce more of its own food, then surely that's a net positive.
I think we may be saying the same thing. So to me, the resilience is not for example, doing production subsidies and things like that, but looking for where the market failures are. And the market failures to me seem to be obviously around the environment, but also around our capacity to be able to respond to a food crisis and respond in a way that's resilient and to whatever that food crisis is.
Yes.
Or was that, you want Alex to go?
No, that's fine.
Just so, in terms of what the UK, you touched on what's happening in the next 2 years with Brexit and negotiating trade agreements around the world for the UK. What do you think the UK should be looking to do in relation to food security as part of negotiating new trade agreements?
So it's very hard to do this without being political. Claire mentioned how much food we get from Spain and from the Netherlands and also Poland as well. We need to make certain, in my view, that we have as frictionless trade with those countries as possible.
And in trying to develop new trade policies to try and shift the balance of import and export, is there anything, we have an opportunity at the moment to do something different. Are you, frictionless trade is doing more of the same, and Professor Heffman, you were talking about our over-reliance on a small number of countries, and some of those are in the EU, that's part of the negotiation, but many of them are outside the EU, in Africa, Caribbean. Are you looking for, would you be pushing policymakers to make some changes to the way in which we approach trade negotiations with those countries?
I think that the kind of decision making that and the arguments that are coming out of the literature is the UK going to be a showcase for animal welfare issues, for high value kind of livestock in particular, or are we going to go for production at all costs? So there's kind of there are two roads that we can take here in these trade negotiations. I think that our consumers demand that animals are produced in a welfare friendly way to the best of their ability. So I think we should actually go that way. I think we should be making deals around sustainable farming systems and our trade. And for example, I think 95% of the lambs are sold into Europe. I mean, we've got these trading relationships that are pretty much holistic. So, we do need to get to the bottom of how we're going to continue with these relationships and what they're going to look like. So,
yeah, maybe just to add, I think you're right. It does. We do have an opportunity to make some big changes. I mean, I think we've heard earlier about some of the likely impacts of climate change in the future. And what this means, of course, is that we're already seeing big changes in crop suitability, or areas that were previously well suited to a particular crop not becoming unsuitable in the future. And I think if you could look at that at a global level and then say, well, no, perhaps we should be encouraging production of particular crops in particular areas that are not necessarily sort of ideally suited right now, but say in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And we have the models and the tools to be able to do that in a reasonable way. But of course that opens up all kinds of sort of political issues about food sovereignty in, say, many countries of sub-Saharan Africa, where the government policy has for many years been around self-sufficiency, but that obviously is going to become extremely difficult, not only because of population growth, but in climate change. So I think you're right in a way that there's an opportunity to make some, or to start looking at how the global food systems might adapt themselves. It's not just about smallholder farm adaptation, but can the global food system adapt so that it's better aligned with likely future climate, so that we can make these massive gains in production and productivity that we know are going to be needed to feed the planet.
Thank you.
I'm a bit confused because we were talking about production at all costs, and then we're talking about the amount of fruit and veg that we produce, and then we're talking about high animal welfare, and yet we're saying it's not compatible with upland farming, and we should pay farmers for public goods and sequestration of carbon and peat bog restoration and all of that. I don't get a blueprint for policy from your answers. It sounds to me like you're saying lots of different things, some of which are mutually incompatible. Are you saying we should grow more of our own fruit and veg, given that we're very reliant on, or are you saying if frictionless trade continues, that's fine, carry on with the beef?
Shall I go first on that?
Yeah.
So I'm not a believer in the argument that we should be self-sufficient or we should move towards that. I think we should be part of a global food system. I think many of the things we've talked about, so I strongly support what Claire has said, and I think this relates back to Ms. Lucas's question earlier about meat consumption, that meat consumption needs to go down, and some people choose to be vegetarian or vegan. I personally and many other people, I think, will choose to be flexitarian and eat much less meat, and the meat that we eat should be at the very highest standards of environmental production and welfare. And that to me, would be my policy priority. So not to concentrate on self-sufficiency or increasing production per se, but to make certain we have a very efficient rural sector that provides multiple goods, food and the many other things we talked about, that will be geographically varied and will provide rural incomes to vibrant rural economies, especially in areas such as the uplands where there are few alternatives.
Okay, yeah.
I think that we have to get away from this notion that beef is uniformly bad for the environment. There's very many different types of livestock production systems, and they all have very different impacts on the environment. The kind of research that's going on now, it's really exciting, and it can dramatically change, I think, the outcomes of greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector. We know that like feeding seaweed to cows lowers their methane emission by up to kind of 90%. This is work that's been done, a very small study that's been done at the University of California. So I think there's technologies, there's resilient and more sustainable ways that we can grow these animals. And I think that at a policy level is what we have to move toward. The movement in livestock, it's called low carbon livestock development. It's a sustainability frame where you're looking at bioecosystems and sustainability within that, and you link those up to get a more resilient food system. I think, in my opinion, the food system has to change.
Haven't we been
intensive? Sorry.
I was just going to say health is a big issue here, and it seems perverse to me to be finding out more ways of doing more beef production when we know that we've actually, in the rich countries, need to massively reduce our red meat consumption. So it feels like the policies aren't joined up.
Yeah, I think that when we look at animal source food in the global south, there's a major gap there.
For sure,
and
in the
certainly
south,
if we look at stunting.
So
my sort of core argument is where the food will come in the future, it will be in the global north. So you don't have to eat your beef, but there are people in the global south who will want that animal source food because they have no other ways to get it. So this isn't a big picture in the future. So, I mean, I think I think that resource use in the livestock sector has to change. It's far too resource
transport
intensive.
beef going from one end of the world to the other end of the world. It just doesn't, at the same time as we're talking about a climate-constrained world, we are not going to be having this massive food swap of food going from the one pole to the other. I mean, that isn't going to be sustainable, is it?
Absolutely. I think, of course, it's not. But I think what I'm trying to say is the ability to grow food in the global south is going to be extremely limited. So we can either understand that the breadbasket of the world today is the global north. I mean, it is. This is where most of the food is produced. So I think if we ignore that dynamic and we continue to think that we're going to support these small-scale farmers and that suddenly they're going to be completely self-sustaining, I think that is the problem. We need ways to grow food, to transport food more sustainably. We need it across these sectors, the global food system. So, I mean, in some respects, I absolutely agree with you.
We're still going to have to transport food between countries. We've been feeding lamb salt marshes for hundreds of years, so maybe that's been an accidental low-carbon bit of lamb production. No, it tastes good. Dr. Thornton, and then we're going to move very quickly on.
Yeah, just to add here on, of course, there are many livestock producers in the global south who are not connected with markets, hardly at all. And
that's where the waste occurs, because there's no refrigeration, there's no salting, there's no drying, there's no education.
Right. In fact, the livestock are kept as, they're massively important for livelihoods, because they provide assets, they're a mobile bank, and they provide milk and blood and for diets and so on and so forth. And there's something like 400 million at the last count, very rough count, of poor livestock keepers or poor livestock keepers who are almost totally dependent on livestock as one of their few or only assets.
Yeah.
And I think we can't ignore them. Mm-hmm. The other point I was just going to make was around new technology, and Claire's just mentioned seaweed, but alternative protein sources for feed, as well as for human food. I think these are things that we really should be. There's a lack of evidence, I would say, around how effective some of these things are, what impacts they have on the environment, their greenhouse gas emission potential, or how they use natural resources. I think there's a lot of evidence that could be generated about things, or methanogenesis in ruminants. So how can you reduce that again? Not only through diets, but through other means. So I think there's a whole raft of technologies that they're in different stages of development, obviously. And I think there are many things that could be done, and that can have a big effect on the food system in general, not only in production, but also around in marketing and processing and storage. Again, these are things that are extremely important in the global south. And they tend to be somewhat things that are, or areas of research that have not been done. There's a real lack of evidence on how sometimes quite simple things can make a big difference.
Like access to a radio, so you can get the weather forecast,
exactly.
And your crop yield increases by 17%.
Or off your mobile phone, or storage, very simple storage methods, and that can really cut down on waste. So I think they're all examples of things where I think the food system in the large, it really has to change.
Great, thank you. Kerry.
Okay. Can I ask about the carbon footprint of agriculture? I think you said that if you include land conversion, it's about 30% of greenhouse gases. Does that just apply to the farming end of the food chain? It wouldn't apply to manufacturing, transportation, and those issues, is that right?
I can read in the exact figures into the transcript if you like. My memory is that it is the food chain.
Yeah. Okay. So if there was a processed ready meal, so we during the horse meat scandal, we were hearing about these 99p lasagnas that seem to have done a tour of Europe. Literally like going through about 15 different countries on their way to being sold in the UK. And I have no idea how you can do that and them still be worth 99p. But at each stage of that process, there's obviously a carbon impact and transportation costs. So I just wondered if things like that, or whether it was just the beef being transported and the raw produce being transported,
So it's a very complicated field, as you've hinted at, and when it's done well, it includes all those things in it.
Right, okay.
And there are complexities because there's this enormous trade in, we both import and export chicken, but we import the cuts we like and then export the cuts we don't like, sometimes to the Far East. And of course that has a negative carbon footprint, but then it's positive in the sense we're not wasting any part of the chicken. So it's very hard to make generalizations, but one has to look really carefully at specific food chains, and again, transparency, getting the data out there is really important.
And am I right in thinking our emissions are judged, so our progress against emissions targets are judged according to production rather than consumption of food? So how does that work? So so our fossil fuel use, whatever, it's in this country, but if there is fossil fuel use abroad or the land conversion abroad, does that count towards us when we're looking at whether we're meeting our emissions targets? Does the fact that we might be importing soya to feed British cattle from a Brazilian former rainforest, is that factored in at all?
Yes, it is.
That is, right, because I thought it was just, I thought the figure was just production of emissions rather than consumption. So anything we consume in this country, the carbon footprint of that would be factored in?
So I look to my colleagues in case they're experts in this, but as footprinting and carbon assessment and auditing has advanced as a subject, then it's becoming better at including these upchain effects.
Yeah, because there's been some concern we're actually exporting the problem to an extent.
Yes. And I think carbon is quite good. Where it's harder at is water. And then again, as I think you've looked at in the past, then concepts such as virtual water, how much we're bringing in is beginning to enter the analyses.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so the science of life cycle assessment is advancing all the time, and I think it's true we're getting much better at being able to do these, so that you can get a sort of an overall sort of systematic estimate of what's happening.
What we're actually doing. Well, that's helpful. And we know that the agriculture sector hasn't seen much progress at all, and as other sectors like energy and waste have improved, the proportion of agriculture is responsible for our carbon footprint has gone up. Why do you think that is, and what are the key things that would help us make progress? There's been all sorts of reports, and I did a debate in 2009 about the livestock sector's environmental impact, and have to be saying you're sort of widely ridiculed for it, I think, but it was when the UN did Livestock's Long Shadow report, and we've had quite a lot of reports since then, but I don't see any signs that there's anybody's really taking it, well, anybody in terms of political action, I don't see it's being taken seriously.
Shall I go first and then?
Sure.
So I think that there is a beginning of political momentum to bring agriculture into the international climate frameworks. I think there are two issues holding it back in this country. First of all, and this is just not the agricultural sector, but we don't have a proper price on carbon. And if we did, and if that included agriculture, that would be hugely valuable. But even if we had that, we would then need to have a mechanism such that many people at the lower end of the income spectrum in this country who are livestock farmers, especially the smallholders, that they had an alternative way of essentially surviving or making their income and making a living. So I think one needs progress sort of on the technical side and also on the sort of social side, both of which, I mean, these are, I don't have to tell you, really hard political problems.
Yeah. Does anyone?
Yeah, if I may just add to that, I think if you look at the data, you'll see that efficiency of production, if you measure efficiency in terms of greenhouse gases emitted per kilo of product, say for milk or meat, there have been enormous increases in efficiency. But of course, part of the issue is if there's increased production, then you're still, unless you're cutting the number of animals, so each animal itself may be more productive, more efficient, but then if you're increasing the number of animals, then you're still going to see an overall increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, to me, this highlights again the importance of trying to make agricultural production as efficient as possible, but then that means we've got to do the other side of the equation, which is reducing the numbers in this case, reducing the numbers of livestock in intensive systems, for example.
So how does that... Because when people say efficiency, I tend to think of intensive farming where you're trying to get as much as possible out of, as many animals as possible in a smaller space as possible. But then you sort of said about sustainability. So, is the what is the answer in terms of, or are they incompatible? Should it be the more sustainable agroecological approach, or is it all down to economies of scale and...
No, I think it's
doing more with the less.
It's very much down to sort of addressing some of these trade-offs, and so efficiencies, yes, it's important, but then, as Claire has mentioned about animal welfare and sustainability, and so these are quite difficult balancing acts in a way, and we can't do sort of one thing without the other, but there are ways in which these things can be traded off. With analyses and models that can show sort of most appropriate levels of input for particular levels of outputs, and also, as Charles has said, I think the importance of a decent price on carbon would make a huge difference, I think.
So in terms of the agroecological approach, I mean, that's lower inputs, and people haven't mentioned things like fertilisers, for example, which would have an impact. Is that something that you think would make a significant difference if you were farming in a more sustainable way, so there's far less inputs in terms of what you then produce?
I'm going to give an answer which I realise it is rather unsatisfactory, because I think that is very context specific. I do not think that all intensive farming is unsustainable. Some is tremendously good, some is awful, and the same applies to smallholder farmers. So if one had a mechanism that can pick out the best of more intensive and more extensive farming, which will be different in different parts of the country, that would be the way to get the greatest sustainability and reduction in carbon footprints.
But I think what the context that's happening now in the UK is the swing towards intensification. So there's, I think it's 789 mega farms now, and that population is growing. And the issues around pollution, environmental pollution, and climate change are more significant when you're talking about these amounts of animals. So it's not impossible to have a low carbon strategy, but I think we do need to have a low carbon strategy for these units.
Great, thank you. Alex?
I think we've talked about or questioned about the adaptations needed in the farming, within farming. But what other adaptations do you think are required in the food system, particularly here in the UK, outside of farming?
Who wants to go first?
Very briefly, I think that industry have done a lot already. And again, some of the same tools that we've talked about, proper pricing on carbon, will help there. I think there's a great challenge in the home. If you look where the majority of food waste is, it's in the home. I think that one of the encouraging things is changing in social norms, that we talk much more about food waste than we used to, that there are programs on the television and such. And I think just making people more aware of that issue, making it less socially acceptable to waste food, is actually the best way we can do there.
We did, in a previous inquiry, have Adam Smith from Junk Food, from Wakefield, and he talked about that actually the food industry was particularly items like bread were these were just going into the waste system and were not being actually utilised by people. So it didn't sound from his evidence that actually the food industry were moving. I take your point about home, but they were moving towards having a low waste or zero waste food system. And obviously we hear about the French law and then charities being unable to cope in France, the amount of food being dumped on them by manufacturers. So that's clearly not a holistic solution. What do you think the solution is, though, for that end of the market?
It's interesting that I guess I was thinking more of some of the retailers. I think that's a challenge for this House to the Parliament to actually get the incentives right, because there is some economically rational waste from the point of view of the individual business. And if that is the equivalent of a landfill tax, but in a more sophisticated way, this is an area where industry is highly responsive to signals and such. And I think getting the regulatory environment right would be the way to progress that.
That's very helpful. In terms of technologies, obviously that's a legislative method, an economic method we can use. What do you think are the most promising technology developments in food systems for adapting to environmental changes? So we hear about things like lab-grown meat. Is that something that we might want to consider, or are there other developments?
My group in Oxford has just done a report from the World Economic Forum on alternative proteins, which I'm happy to submit if that would be useful. I think that we have some tremendously valuable alternatives to meat at the moment, largely based on plant-based alternatives at the moment, which will become increasingly to the fore and will have major environmental benefits. The environmental aspect more than health. My guess, and this really is a guess, is that within a decade, possibly within 2 decades certainly, we will be able to produce in the laboratory meat that is essentially looks like a steak in front of you. To me, it's still very hard to assess the environmental component of that. Certainly the people who are more optimistic think that the environment component will be much better. I think it's almost the social science rather than the natural science will determine what will happen, whether we flick over into thinking that it's fake meat and yuck, or whether we flip the other side to think that this is a major contribution to the to environmental things. And again, just going back to my point, I think it's absolutely critical to have a pathway for the people who are going to be lose out on this, the people who are producing livestock at the moment.
Yeah.
May I add to that?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, I think a couple of things here. One would be using or utilising new technology to actually tell consumers what has actually gone into the food that they're eating or the food that they're purchasing. So if I know we've talked about the difficulty of doing life cycle assessments for greenhouse gas emissions, but if we could come up with sort of relatively simple measures, so if you go to a supermarket, you've got some beans grown locally, beans grown in Kenya, you can give the consumer sort of some information on which he or she can make sort of more rational decisions. And I think there are some new technologies coming that could be used for that. I think the artificial meat issue is extremely important, and we're also involved in a study which I'm also happy to submit to the committee about if you like, blue sky technologies and how these may affect different aspects of the food system in the coming 10 to 15 years. I think one of the issues around here is, if you like, social license. So what does society agree is reasonable in terms of sort of how our food system may evolve? So this idea of artificial meat, is that something that's socially acceptable? I mean, if it's based on or from stem cells, for example, is that a thing that society can we all agree that this is a way that we can move forward? I mean, similar to, I guess, the GM debate in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, and I think these kinds of things can be utterly constraining, or on the flip side, they can really sort of help to open up enormous opportunities for making massive changes to the food system. So I think these are things that need to be looked at.
I suppose it's a sociological cultural debate about both those things, both about plant-based proteins, alternatives to meat, and lab-grown meat, which might be slightly outside the remit of our inquiry. And what do you think the role of the private sector is, and what do you think that their research needs might be in terms of a transformation of the food system, for instance, around food waste, or reducing the environmental impact of the industry?
I think the private sector is leading at the moment in some of the new ideas around alternative proteins and plant-based substitutes. It's sad to me that although some of the original IP comes from the UK, most of the activity in this area is in the United States, in the Netherlands and in Israel. And I'd like to see us be a bit more adventurous in investing in some of these alternative proteins.
And the government clearly would have a role, could have a role in
Very
that
much
through
so.
research councils.
Very much so.
Okay, that's useful.
I'm happy to provide an enabling environment for innovation, perhaps at very small scale for pilots that could be then run and, if successful, then scaled up massively.
Thank you. Just coming back on the food waste, one of the things when I visited the Junk Food Project was to see pallets of bread piled up and they were being decanted out of their bags and going to a pig farmer. So none of it's going into landfill, but it's certainly not being some of it isn't being redistributed to families. It's going to pig farmers because the volumes of bread, and it allows the supermarkets to say, well, that's fine, nothing to landfill, but then you've got a charity struggling to get the stuff out of the door as the mountains of bread arrive on a daily basis. It's quite extraordinary, yeah.
And I think it'd be very interesting to examine some of the issues around sell-by dates.
Yeah,
some of the rules about whether waste can go to insects, whether waste can go to pigs, and just whether we can push, as RAP say, the waste hierarchy, if we can just push things further up and, of course, prevent a waste going in the first place. Yeah,
we've been just going along, taking pallets and giving them out at school gates, and you find people are very happy to take 2-day-old bread, and out-of-date crisps. It's not been a problem redistributing it. It's just a question of linking the markets with the excess waste, and it's that linkage that's, I think, really difficult to make. And the destigmatisation as well, because no one wants to shop on what's called waste, even though some of this stuff is perfectly sellable. Great, thank you all very much indeed for that. It's been a very interesting panel. Lots of food for thought. Order.
Thank you very much.
No, I'm doing 6.
Is currently suspended. The proceeding 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 is currently suspended.
Call our second panel to order and ask them to introduce themselves, starting from my left with Dr. Vermeulen.
Hello, yes, my name is Sonia Vermeulen. I am an associate fellow at Chatham House, and I have also worked on CGIR and WWF, the charity, recently. And what I think I bring to the panel today is knowledge on environmental impacts of food systems at the global scale.
Thank you.
I'm Tim Lang. I'm Professor of Food Policy at City University of London Centre for Food Policy. I don't know what I bring to this panel, that's for you to decide. But I've, like Sonia, actually, we've just been on the Eat Lancet Commission report on food in the Anthropocene, which I think is probably relevant to this committee.
Yes.
Judith Batchelor, I'm Director of Sainsbury's Brands, Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability. I'm also a non-exec Director of the Environment Agency, and I think to Sonia's point, what I bring to the panel is the customer end of this and being a practitioner in this space.
I'm Simon Billing, Director of Eating Better Alliance. It's an alliance, civil society alliance of more than 50 organisations from across the health and environmental field, working to really make sustainable diets very much the norm.
Great, thank you. Well, I noticed you all sat in on the first panel, and we've had a report out on hunger a couple of weeks ago and malnutrition in the UK as part of our work on the Sustainable Development Goals. What policies or structures do we need in this country to make sure that all people have access to a healthy diet and an environmentally sustainable diet? Tim, I know you want to start.
Yeah. I think I can say something about that. Well, it would help to have a national food policy, can I say, firstly, and back to John McNally's point earlier about Scotland and the devolved administrations. Actually, both Wales and Scotland have been doing much more interesting and dynamic things. I think it would also help if we had a clearer connection between national policy and local policies. Local policies are having to pick up on the messes of food poverty and waste, and they're underfunded, and that just is not delivering any coherence to the food system at all. I think it would be, back to the previous panel's very interesting discussion, personally I would call it, what we need is a multi-criteria approach. That sounds very pompous, but it's about putting together all the bits that we have evidence on. We can't just say, well, it's all got to be about the environment or all about health. It's got to be about both, but also about social values and ethical issues and economic realism, as opposed to trust and consumer attitudes. We haven't got that thinking. We've got bits, and one of the many things I'm critical of DEFRA for is it doesn't provide that leadership. I'd really like you in this report to say we actually could do with a food policy. I've said to Mr. Gove personally, I no longer call him Secretary of State for DEFRA, I call him DERA, because he never talks about food. We've got an environment bill, we've got an agricultural bill which is basically environmental land management approach, which is very good and excellent and long overdue, but unless we balance that with the discussion you were having earlier about does Britain want to produce any food at all, or are we just going to become a neo-colonial country, there's got to be some direction on this, and we haven't got that at the moment. So for me, that would be the number one thing, a multi-criteria approach, a national policy would help. Brexit or no Brexit, we're showing that we haven't got that. Look at the desperation of the retailers and food industry. We're not being clear about Labour, about the Labour policy. Personally, Sonia and I have spent 3 years on the Lancet Commission report, which says very clearly if we want to feed 10 billion people by 2050, we're going to have to eat very differently, all sorts of ways you were hedging around in the previous panel. Basically much less meat, much more fruit and vegetables, much more plant growth at the farm level without using up more land, direct to humans, cutting down the waste. And that isn't going to be easy, but Britain has got to take a lead on it, not least because our default is always let someone else grow the food for us. And I'm afraid the modelling shows that's unacceptable. We've got to grow more food here. It's sliding down. DEFRA is not even clear what the figures are. Some of DEFRA's figures, HMRC and ONS derived, are that we're only producing 49% of our own food. That's less than we ended 1945 on. And others say, well, it's about 61%. If you're in the Arctic Circle, maybe that's excusable. If you've got fantastic soils, fantastic rainfall, fantastic variability of climate, we could grow more better. And that doesn't mean to say intensively or with huge carbon emissions, but we've got to balance it all. Biodiversity, water, soil, good carbon emission controls, alongside good for public health, and we're not doing that at the moment. The NHS is being damaged inexorably by diet-related disease. It's the gap between rich and poor is at more than Victorian levels. We're living longer, but the gap between the super rich and the super poor is wider than it was when this building was built. This is an unacceptable situation for a rich country to be in. So I want a national food policy that puts those criteria together. It's possible.
Thank you. Kerry?
Can I just ask, I mean, there's been lots of reports that have come to similar conclusions to the Lancet report. I think the good thing about the Lancet report is that it covers the environmental side, which Chatham House did a really good report on a few years ago, or did a whole series of work. But it covers the public health angle as well. But it gets the press coverage. What response have you had from government ministers? Has anyone invited you in to talk about it at all? Have you asked if you can go in and talk about it? Is there any sign? I mean, obviously straddles a couple of departments in that it's health and food and farming, and we always have this problem that Bays covers the manufacturing and the supermarkets role. But have you had any sign that ministers are going to do anything with it? That's just my frustration.
We've not had anything officially. I was looking at Sonia, I don't think we've had anything officially. What we can say is there is huge interest in it. Yeah. In different parts of the world, it's been picked up by governments, picked up by business, picked up by civil society. In Britain, it's mostly so far we've been picked up by civil society and the professions, the public health and environment and the NGO world. And indeed, food companies have been much more supported. To be fair to the government, perish the thought one's ever fair to government, but they've got other things on their mind. But the Lancet Commission report was really good timing. Here's the sort of vision that a British government could and should run with. There are things happening from it in this country. The Food and Farming and Countryside Commission of the Royal Society of Arts is jointly holding a meeting next month about it, getting ministers to come to it and things like that. So I think a process is developing. It should have happened. But in other countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, the Nordics, the Nordic Council has already run with it. The Norwegian government is pursuing and funding development and pursuit of this, trying to build on it.
EAT is Swedish, isn't it? Or it has a conference
EAT is Norwegian.
It's Norwegian, is it?
Norwegian Foundation.
Right, okay.
The Nordics, the Nordic Council, the governments are much more interested. But for example, I mean, I think Sonia was there, but we held the EAT Foundation and Lancet, we held a consultation meeting in Bangkok last year that was huge, where governments were there wanting to run with it. So I think there's much more interest in this from governments than we actually hoped 3 years ago. But that's my view. What's yours?
Particularly strong take-up in Sweden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
It has a commitment to it from 2000, Mary. Swedish government set out a commitment to try and address the 1992 agenda, the UNCED agenda. Sweden was delegated by the European Union and offered to the European Union to be the lead member state for the European Union on dealing with and addressing climate change and the UNCED agenda from 1992. So Sweden's got a long track record of taking this seriously before the rest of the European member states. But having said that, Britain was heavily involved in a very interesting consortium of Northern European member states that was emerging in 2007, 8, 9, 10. I regret to say it stopped sharp in 2010. But the other member states, Netherlands, France, Germany, and the Nordics are still running with that. They're being much more proactive if you look at those governments. And Sweden and Spain, Italy, France, Portugal are beginning to pick up and run with it too.
Okay, Dr. Vermeulen, what do you think needs to happen? Do you think the UK is prepared for what's coming?
Right. I did warn the people organising this that wouldn't count myself as an expert on UK policy. So I'll look at it from a global perspective and and bring in this Eat Lancet report. So I think this future world that we spell out it's been given a lot of attention from the red meat perspective, but it goes far beyond that. And just to take that full picture, so we advise actions in 5 areas. 3 of those are to do with production. One of them is to do with dietary change, and the last is to do with food waste. So I think, first of all, the first strong message there is those issues around how we are farming and what we are growing. So our 3 messages around the production side are we should change the emphasis in farming from maximising cheap calories to producing healthy foods. Secondly, we should optimise use of inputs in that production. This goes back to the intensification question. And then thirdly, and very importantly, we need to think about the governance of areas that we're reserving from farming. So, for example, we propose that 10% of all marine areas that are currently wild fished should be completely protected from that. So you have very large agendas around environmental management and management of farms. And then additionally, the food waste one I feel is a little overemphasised, but it's there. And then around diets, let's think about that future of diets. So our diet spells out around 1 portion of red meat per week, around 2 of poultry, which can be swapped out for eggs, for instance, and then around 2 of fish. It also spells out massive increases in intake of certain plant products. Now, let's go into those in some detail, because a lot of that is around eating more pulses and eating more nuts. These are very underproduced things at the moment, globally, so we would need to be shifting production towards those. They are, of course, not without their own environmental issues. So nut farms, for instance, those of you who are familiar with California will know that the almond farms there are very water intensive and also require pollinators to be shipped from the east coast to the west coast every year. So we would need to be preparing already for something, a world of farming where we could, for instance, have far, far lower emissions, but we would be dealing with a number of more local environmental issues and should be prepared in advance. Similarly, around the kind of meat and fish areas, with meat, I think most of us on the panel would agree that we're certainly not looking at a completely vegan future. The scientific evidence is actually that a mixed farming system with some animal production is in fact the most sustainable at the global level, with a huge amount of regional variation. And then with fisheries, I think this is again an interesting one. This is part of the protein question, which didn't come up. I came in late to the earlier part. But if we envisage a future with much greater fish consumption, we will also be needing to look at that coming out of fish farms. Where are those located? And most importantly, what are those fish being fed? So we go back to this huge technology space. I believe actually this is one of Simon's areas of expertise, of looking at the future of feeds for fish and other livestock. So what I've attempted to spell out to you is without saying what I know about British policies at the moment, that I think we need to be highly anticipatory in terms of diets and in terms of what we're growing on our farms and how intensively we're managing those. And I do think that Britain is well placed to put an immense advanced research effort into that. So I back up the previous panellists on that.
Great, thanks. Ms. Batchelor, what is the food industry doing to make preparations for this brave new world?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is to say that what we're talking about is highly complex and interconnected. So whilst we are a UK retailer, we are a global business. So we're sourcing from over 70 countries around the world. So we have to think about things on both the global and a national level, and indeed at a local level, and as far as our customers are concerned, at an individual level, in terms of how we can help customers make those choices. Because of that, and because of the fact that science and technology, as we've already heard, is evolving, and our access to data is unprecedented. So I think there's that lovely statistic that 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. The information that we have at our fingertips is enormous. And therefore, how do you bring all of that together to solve it? So we talk about the grand challenges, and indeed the grand challenges for the whole sector, right from soil health all the way through to what happens to a product or packaging at the end of its life, which is requiring us to stop thinking about things as a value chain in a linear sense and to start thinking about food systems. And that's really difficult because quite often we haven't even mapped all those interdependencies and that interconnectedness. And then when we do, it's mind-blowing. So one of the things that we're starting to do is ask government for more guidance. So things like setting targets on food waste reduction through wrap and the same with actually plastics, and then setting a roadmap that helps us get there, along with reporting protocols. So the food waste, again, a good example. We now have a food loss and waste reporting protocol that is accepted at an international level. So how we would report on food waste and how our collaborative partners in other parts of the world could report on food waste would be the same. So we're talking the same language and talking the same currency in terms of metrics, providing those, I suppose, enablers to get us to understand the baseline. Where are we starting from? Where's the direction of travel? Set some ambitious targets. So Champions 12.3, for example, or indeed the RAP food waste roadmap. So we're going to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. You know, what does that look like? How we're going to get there? And then the other thing that government has done is link up the work of the research councils and Innovate UK. And again, same things happened on plastics, to say how can we make sure that NERC or BBSRC or EPSRC are funded around these grand challenges to ensure that we are creating the research that's been missing, informing the technology so that this amazing data that we're collecting we can now use in the right way. And that sounds like a long answer, but until we start to talk about facts, for us as a business, understanding where the materiality is, so where we put our efforts for the greatest impact in that complicated system, will be wishful thinking, and it just needs to be much more deep-rooted in data and the technology. I would also add that sounds quite scary, but there's some really nice examples of where it's already happening. So we just talked about fish, and I think fish is a classic. We know that 25% of the world's fish is probably illegally caught, unregulated, unreported. But we have the technology to look at what's happening in the oceans. We know that from work with things like the satellite catapult at Harwell, which is government funded, has created a tool called Ocean Mind. Ocean Mind can look at the algorithms of fishing vessels, can see where they are registered, can look at their quota for the time of year, where they should be, how they're fishing, and then can track that to what was then landed from that vessel when it lands. We've never been able to see that before. If you take that and then say, we've got a discard challenge around fish that's caught that doesn't need to be caught, Aberdeen University doing great work on selective fishing gear. That means that you don't catch undersized fish or species you don't have a quota for. And then if you take all of that and say, even if we have now a realistic view of sustainable biomass in those fisheries, we've got the gap that means if we all want to eat 2 portions of fish a week, aquaculture has to fill that gap. How can aquaculture with sustainable feed and really good feed conversion rates create a sustainable aquaculture industry that enables everyone to have a healthy, affordable diet? And I say that because sometimes we think this is very overwhelming, but there are things where the future's already happening. It's just not widespread and it's not common practice. It's best practice.
Thank you. Simon, you're
So-
the expert on sustainable feed.
Yeah, so first, I guess our interest is about dietary change. It's been touched on a lot across the last hour and a half. We would welcome to work with government. We have sort of 50 organisations from some of the biggest environmental, wildlife, animal welfare to health organisations. And we are really pushing along less and better. So for a step change reduction in meat, aligned very closely with the work that that has been advocated by the Eat Lancet Commission. And we would like to support government to really create the right environment to get us on that journey. And I think I would echo Tim's point. The first thing that would really help us would be a joined-up conversation across government, an integrated food strategy. The Climate Change Committee are looking at diets. DEFRA are looking at diets. PHE are looking at diets. There are 12 departments across government that are interested in livestock. I would encourage the committee to bring that conversation together and offer some leadership for an integrated food strategy. I would encourage us to focus on the Eat Well plate. As many people come to me now and say, I've got a beef with beef, I'd say stop that, look at the Eat Well guide. If we ate better, which is my mantra now, waking up and eat better, we would eat closer to the Eat Well guide. We're not eating that now. I would encourage, and it is great to see Judith and Sainsbury's obviously announcing a greater range of options for both plant-based and better meat, because we do think we want to see a growth of better meat. We did a survey of ready meals, which 9 out of 10 of us, to be honest, eat. Only 1 in 4 of those are non-meat options. Only 3% of them are plant-based. So we need to improve the accessibility. I think that needs to quickly now move into public procurement and public spaces. Many of the Alliance are now calling for vegetarian default. You go to a committee meeting, you have to ask for meat if you want meat. Change the conversation. And then I think we should be exploring fiscal measures, which a number of people across the House has been a conversation around that, and looking both at the incentives for eating better, so eating more plant-based, but it has to be within a sustainable, healthy diet, and we need to bring the health and the environmental agenda together. And I would have thought we were there, but I still don't think we're quite there.
Thank you, it's very helpful. Caroline.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the Eat Lancet Commission just for a moment, and I guess you've probably already answered most of this, but is there anything more that you would say about the great food transformation? In a minute, I want to ask you what the obstacles would be to that great food transformation. Is there anything you would say about what that actually is meant by that? I mean, you've already explained that you're doing far more veg and nuts and away from meat, but is there anything else you'd like to say about that before we move on to the barriers there too?
I was wanting Sonia to go first, but she wants me to go first. Since I coined the phrase, I better defend it.
Yes, you better
well, the reason we came up with that phrase was because there needed to be something that summarised the fact that the world is going here and we now know it needs to go there. And there are very interesting things happening everywhere, as Judith said, Simon said, Sonia said, at all different levels in all countries. Farmers are doing interesting things, restaurateurs, chefs are doing interesting things, but it's not being joined up, the point that Simon was just making very, very rightly. And so we suggested in the discussions of the policy committee that I chaired in the Eat Lancet Commission, that somehow we need to bring all of this together and not stipulate what countries should do or regions should do or industry should do, but say the broad direction of travel. Say how you do it in China or in India or Rajasthan as opposed to Sri Lanka, you know, it's up to you. Or if you're a city like London as opposed to a town like Bristol or Brighton, your area, and Hove, it's going to be different. How you do it, and your mechanisms, your measures, the point that Simon was making. A city can do some procurement work but can't do taxation. Only government can do taxation and fiscal measures. But all of that has to be in some coherence. And that's what the phrase, the Great Food Transformation, was saying. Because just to remind you, I don't think either Sonia or I said, the remit, the brief of the Lancet Commission 3 years ago was to say, is it possible to provide a healthy diet, get agreement on a healthy diet, and feed 10 billion people by 2050 without further damaging and indeed trying to improve the health of the environment? And I confess I was quite dubious, but by the end we showed it's possible. It is possible, firstly, to stipulate from the intervention. Your committee advisor is a very eminent person in this area. We know the broad public health picture. We know broadly the environmental data. Can we put those together? Well, it hasn't been well enough done in the past. There have been other reports which have done bits of it, but it hasn't been brought together. And the bit that was missing is the social bit. People, what Simon was raising. Will consumers buy it? What does food culture, what are the cultural signals? So the phrase was to try to capture all of that.
And how do you think governments could and should deliver it? Because in a sense, what you've described is a very holistic view, which is exactly what there should be, because that's what the world is like. However, as you will know, certainly this way we organise ourselves in this government and parliament is in silos. Yeah. So how would you hope, if we focus just on the UK for the moment, that the UK government would respond to this? Does it need to set up a multifaceted cross-governmental committee that covers all of the very many areas of this? Because the trouble is, if it just goes to DEFRA or if it just goes to FAYS, then it doesn't have the connectedness that seems to be at the heart of what you're describing.
Forgive me, Karen, I was only answering on the terms of the Lancet Commission, which was global. Yeah. I'll speak as me, as Professor of Food Policy. What we need is new structures. DEFRA isn't working. The advisory system is not coordinated. We lack advice in some areas where we should have it. We don't have good consumer advice. The Committee on Climate Change is exploring that. There isn't a consumer committee which can address sustainable diets. We ought to have a sustainable dietary guideline in Britain. There has been 20 years of fight at the Food Standards Agency and Public Health England levels to get environment at least included alongside public health. Alan Dangor and I have talked about this many years ago. We've got it creeping in at the bottom of the Eat Well plate, as Simon said, rightly we should use. There's a little bit about be careful about red meat consumption, processed meat consumption. That actually came out of joint work by PHE and the Carbon Trust. Unless we have joint working like that, which Simon was calling for, I agree, but my own view is we should borrow the Nordics. We should have a food policy council. We should have a national council that provides expert advice on this holism and what is missing in it. We don't have that at the moment. The countries which have it, the Nordic countries have that. No wonder their streets ahead. They're taking it seriously. They're bringing together data. They're calling together people. You're a very unusual committee in that you collect information across the disciplines. Most select committees are very, as you said, siloed. So some coordination mechanism the British government should lead. We need a legal basis to that. I think many of us are looking in Britain at the effectiveness of the Welsh Assembly government's Future Generations Act. I think it's a very good act, but frankly it's not getting the legs that it deserves. It's not being translated, but that's partly because Wales actually has to turn to England because it gets a lot of its food. It exports meat, but it imports its fruit and vegetables. We don't have the joined upness at the UK level, and that's fundamentally what is missing at the moment. So I hope that's one of your recommendations of your committee report. We need a national food policy which integrates these things. We need new institutions and some cross-fertilisation and joint working of those institutions. It's not happening at the moment.
Can I just add to that point?
Do you agree with that?
I do. And I know we've also tried that in the past, and you were part of that. And it may be worth us trying to understand why, when we've tried that approach in the past, it's failed.
Yeah.
Well, if it's closed, Judith, sorry to interrupt you, the Council of Food Policy Advisors, which was a tentative step in this direction, wasn't like the Nordic Nutrition Council or the Danish Food Council. Proper institutional, like the Sustainable Development Commission, 55 staff, proper commissions, Parliament, Prime Minister's appointments. We need something with some clout.
Yeah,
sorry.
I agree.
But did you in terms of learning the lessons?
Come in, so did you want to finish up why did it end?
Yeah.
Yes, and I think
politically was cut.
Yes, I think two things: that there wasn't the burning platform that there is now, because we were still hopeful that things that we would do to combat obesity, some of those longer-term health issues associated with diet, we didn't know anything like the information that we know now around environment and the impact of our food system on the environment. So I think we are in a very different place, and there is that sense of urgency. And I think the really biggest thing that group would have to address is, what does that transition programme look like in a very intelligent and data-informed way? Because I think we all know where we're trying to get to. The question is how we get there in the most efficient and least disruptive way.
And can we get the public to buy it?
Because it feels to me like it just how do you generate the political will as well? I mean, I know, yes, one way to do that is to get the public to demand it, but it just feels so frustrating. The much quicker way would just be to have a word with the people in power and just get them to change the legislation.
We don't have a Climate Change Act equivalent in food. Climate Change Act has a big impact on food. We need a biodiversity. We've got biodiversity commitments, they're not being translated into practice. You know, in everyday cultural terms, we know, Sonia and I know, having spent years on this, that actually we've got to get biodiversity into the field, not just on the edge of the field, into the field and down our throats. That's actually the kind of thing we've got to do. In
that's
a
what,
low water
we did
embedded.
recommend that in our report on the
It
future
was
environmental.
excellent. But now where's the leverage? Where's the legal basis? Where are the benchmarks? That's what Judith is saying, and rightly so. We need to have some start at 2015, slice back. How are we going to begin this process of change?
We are looking at the Environment Act, but so far we've only got the principles and governance to look at.
We haven't got a Food Act, Mary.
No.
And that's what we need. Mr. Gove doesn't want a Food Act. Why?
We're going to talk about consumers with some questions from Alex about whether people are ready to swallow it.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the Eat Lancet Commission, but do you think there's any evidence that populations are ready to make these major changes to their diets? Are we in a cultural, sociological space to make these changes?
So I think what's exciting, and I think what people need to be aware of here is this, and Judith can back me up on this, there is a groundswell of interest, particularly amongst younger people, around diets. I mean, we've never really seen this swell of interest, and different people are tracking somewhere. Our own data is tracking somewhere about 44-45% are either reducing their meat or looking at their dietary change. So there's a groundswell of interest. Business is responding. You could see all the major retailers doing things. Food service is responding. So I think the climate is there. It's good. I take a little pre-warning that there is still low levels of awareness between the impacts of production, food production, and climate change, which is a challenge. So I think we need to build awareness around that still, so people's understanding that climate change, food production, particularly livestock, impacts climate. And I do think we need to find smarter ways of talking about it and the language, and some of that is around balance, and I think there is a very possibly built on by the Lancet, a very emotional discussion going on outside these doors now around the future of food. And I think we're looking for government to be quite rational, and again, that's why I point back to the Eat Well guide and the balance and the importance, absolutely critical importance of government leadership right now, because you have interests both from the farming community and those from the more plant-based future that are being played off in the mainstream media. So I think we need to find ways of talking about it, particularly around balance, particularly addressing food waste and the things that we're all really care about. So I think there is interest.
We're obviously just coming to the end of Veganuary, and I've noticed, including Judith's supermarket, a huge increase in range of plant-based alternatives to meat, which is very helpful. Thank you for sharing. Like last year's Veganuary, did we see a continuation of that? Was there a long tail effect? Obviously Sainsbury's and other supermarkets will have the data for this year's. What's the sort of trend? What's the reality?
Can I just ask also, is this just the worried middle class? Is this the middle class worried well? Because in my constituency, when I'm giving out bread at the school gates, that people are choosing white over brown. I'm not sure that these health messages about meat reduction are necessarily getting through at every level. What evidence is that?
There is a long-term trend, a very long-term trend.
Across all social groups?
Yes, of less red meat consumption, more poultry consumption, more fish consumption. What you're seeing that's to overlay on top of that is now a real spike in customers, and people will talk about the growth in veganism and vegetarianism, and it is huge, but it's still a very small base of customers, tiny. What is the real trend is those people looking for meal occasions that don't involve meat, which Charles Godfrey...
Isn't every meal an occasion?
Yeah. It is, yes. That he called flexitarianism, but it is the 35% of meat eaters that are having less meat occasions during the week, and they're not necessarily doing that for overt environmental or health reasons or animal welfare reasons. They're actually doing it because the opportunity for those foods, to eat those foods, is greater. Say pasta, for example, with a tomato sauce, technically is a meat-free, dairy-free option, but actually it's just a really nice pasta dish. And if you look at the choice that's out there, it's huge. What we're trialling at the moment, which will be quite interesting, and very happy to share the results, it's part of the Wellcome Trust, Our Planet, Our Health work, is displaying meat-free alternatives, so things like mushroom burgers and other meat-type products in the meat aisle for customers to actively switch out. And that is different because historically you would have put a lot of those products on their own in a special part of the store where customers who want those things go and look for them. So I think those kind of nudges. We've also looking at our online shop and putting, if someone searches burger, putting the meat-free burger top of the search list. So those kind of things to understand whether customers are receptive to that. But generally, customers eating less red meat.
Are they only in the meat section though? Because people like Alex and I and Matthew actually, we wouldn't be looking in the meat section. Yes. So we might be missing out. So, so I'm worried about that.
Yeah. They're across the store. Okay. So if you go and shop Italian, there will be meat-free Italian options.
Okay.
But this was specifically looking at a burger or a sausage or a typical processed meat customer and what they might look for. Just to add to that, I think there is a big responsibility from a nutrition and health perspective to ensure that customers who make those choices don't miss out from a nutrition point of view. So one of the things that we've done, and it comes back to controlled environment growing and investment in technology, is a mushroom that is a source and gives you your entire source of vitamin B12, which vegans and vegetarians would miss out on. And also by treating it with ultraviolet light, you get a vitamin D mushroom as well. So we can kill two birds with one stone. But I think that's one of the unintended... Two mushrooms, yes. It's one of the unintended consequences, if we're not careful, of wholesale changes in diet and what customers might miss out on if we're not careful.
Okay, very quickly.
Just to add that I am very, very encouraged globally by the speed of change in diets, that they can transform over a generation. And we tend to focus on the negative parts, the rise of obesity or diets becoming more globally similar, but just a few points here. One is that the typical diet of a normal person in the world has become more diverse over the last 50 years, much greater range of foods. Secondly, these changes, such as reductions in meat, are not necessarily fashions or blips. So in the United States, since 1970, there's been a 40% reduction in per capita beef consumption. They still need to eat about an eighth of the beef they're eating right now to be really healthy. But nonetheless, it's impressive and sustained.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. Alex?
So I am actually the main shopper in our household, and we have a mixed diet household, and I'm vegetarian, and we have meat eaters. And when I shop for protein, my protein, vegetarian protein, is more expensive than, for instance, the cheaper end of the chicken protein. And so this is a barrier really for people switching. Is there any government action that could encourage dietary changes through subsidies or taxation, maybe to level that playing field of price and cost?
Yeah. No, and I think, no, I'm not sure is the answer, because a lot of these things are around economies of scale and what is the norm. So the things that we're developing now are pretty small scale. So whilst the trend is there, they are not mainstream. And I think the challenge for us is to make those things more mainstream and that pace of change, so that those economies of scale can...
And competition. It's like pasta sauce was 20 years ago. No one bought pasta sauce. You had Heinz ketchup. Pasta sauce wasn't invented. Now there are 60 different types of pasta sauce.
Yes, so I think and that will naturally evolve. I do feel, though, that pace of change is, again, unprecedented, because I have never seen in 30-odd years changes in the way that our customers are buying and consuming food like we have today.
Simon?
So to Alex's point, maybe differing to Judith, I wouldn't discourage us thinking about incentives behind, particularly if we take the gauntlet that's being put down, the Eat Lancet, and the fact that we need to eat more vegetables and more plants in general, are to actually incentives to make that accessible and affordable. I see your point and I see your challenge, and it's also being put back to us when we want to talk about the better. How do we address the sort of income equality around that? So I wouldn't rule out fiscal options, and I think the government should be exploring that. And where there is absolute agreement across the piece, certainly across our alliance, is processed meat, for example, from both a health and sustainability perspective. So I think,
tax it, is that what you suggest?
Potentially looking at different fiscal measures. Tax is one way that's been discussed quite a lot, but certainly pricing would help, because meat is...
Minimum meat pricing, like alcohol?
Potentially something to consider.
Okay, thank you. Matthew?
I wanted to ask you about approaches needed in order to reduce the impact of the food system upon the environment. And when I say approaches, including that technological, business and behavioural approaches. Would you like to start?
I think, well, I'll chip in. I think we're all saying, all of us on this panel, and indeed the previous one, I heard it, we're saying government and policy has to use all the range of measures, which we're not. We're locked into the softest, weakest, least effective end. Advice, information, labelling. their track record is not very good for the sort of big systems change that the data suggest is required. Behaviour change, usually people, when you ask a question like that, mean, behavioural economics. And then usually they mean the soft version of behavioural economics. The hard version of behavioural economics is exactly where Simon and Judith were taking us in response to Mr. Sobel's question, which is fiscal measures, incentives, market shifts. I mean, for example, let me just float an idea around the meat issue. We're focusing, there's a lot of discussion about meat, when actually we should be focusing, Sonia and I would argue, much more upon the doubling of fruit and vegetable consumption and a huge expansion of horticulture, which Britain should be doing, and that's maybe something that should feature in your final report. But what if one set incentives not, or to put a restriction on the amount of grain that can be fed to an animal? What if you incentivized grain production direct for human use as opposed to cattle or poultry or pig use? What if you put a tariff onto importation of soya? These are measures which are possible, which would almost certainly have immediate effect on the profligate use of land to feed animals, inefficient converting animals particularly. In the Lancet Commission report, when we started looking at that and beginning to model that, if you notice, if you've seen it, we do recommend a big switch away from beef and sheep towards poultry and pig, but we have a section which hasn't been commented on very much in the annexes, pages 24 to 25, Mary, if you want to go to see it, about using waste to feed animals. Now that is an issue that goes back to Mr. Sobel's question, where at the moment we have very good reasons for foot and mouth disease. Charles Godfrey, he's still here. DEFRA had really big difficulties with having to slaughter millions of animals because of that. Actually we've got to sort out the technology of using waste that humans can't use, not you handing out bread, 2-day-old bread, but waste which could be converted by pigs or poultry. If we switch from farm use for grain to actually having, as we called it in the report, or the annex of the report, livestock from leftovers, that's a very interesting policy.
Well, that's certainly a very interesting approach. I understand that to produce a kilo of meat, it will take 13 kilos of carbon CO2, and that's like burning 6 litres of petrol. And so I certainly get that argument.
It's whether you look at carbon, or you look at land use, or you look at labour use, or just inefficiency of conversion, it's better to grow the plants and that we eat them direct. If you want meat, have it using other land that can't grow meat. Can't grow grain.
How realistic is that approach, both in the United Kingdom and on a global scale? What would governments need to do?
If we don't act, let me be very stark. The data from the IPCC, let alone the WRI, let alone the Inter-Academies report, let alone the Lancet Commission report, if we don't act on this, it'll hit us in about 20, 30 years' time. The whole purpose of doing this sort of thinking is to say, what's a good food system going to look like for 20, 30 years' time? We're now pretty sure what that looks like. I'm sure things will change slightly, but in the last 10 years, the science hasn't changed much.
But just explain to me, when you say hit us, in what area?
Climate change runs out of control.
Do you mean climate change?
Water use runs out of control. Biodiversity flips. We know it's beyond planetary boundaries already. These are unstoppable changes which will lead to mass migration on a level that most people on the planet can't even conceive. It will lead to destruction of ecosystems on which humanity depends. There are the neo-Malthusians who say, well, so be it, let Darwinian processes occur. I personally, and I'm sure my fellow panellists, and I'm sure you, all don't want that to happen. We humans are pretty stupid but we're not so stupid we can't read the writing on the wall, I hope.
Well, I would come at it, I suppose, a little bit more technically as an environmental scientist. So in the modelling that we did for that paper, and I think this it matches well to other studies that have been done. So we looked across 5 different environmental parameters, which were climate change, biodiversity, nitrogen, phosphorus, and fresh water use. Yeah. And then we looked at where, what kinds of changes across diets, production, and waste cause the most difference. And so what you see is that dietary change has a phenomenal impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but less surprisingly on, for example, our fertilizer use, which then takes us into the area of actually managing how we do agriculture. So the first point is we need to act in both of those together. When you look at the kinds of changes that might have to happen in agriculture around particularly managing those kinds of biodiversity and nutrient cycles, you can then pick out hotspots around the world where it's really out of control at the moment. What I mean by out of control is that farmers are using fertilizers in excess of what's actually helping them to increase yields and to increase returns from the farming. So United States, Pakistan and China particularly stand out. Then you can go into looking at what governments there have tried to do to really bring that down. So China is a very interesting case in point. Farmers are using far in excess of what's actually creating the yields, and that's leading to enormous runoff. And the government has gone into an enormous kind of agricultural extension program to, first of all, try to educate around this, but then also to explore whether there are different kinds of... Farmers are obviously doing this as a risk management, that expense on the fertilizer is well worth it for them just to absolutely assure some yield at the end. So to try and also explore whether there are different kinds of risk management insurance products for these farmers that can help them cope in other ways. So I think for each of these, you can kind of dive in. In many cases, the kinds of technologies we know will work are already there. In agriculture, the big ones are around that soil fertility management. The second big area is around animal management and the management of their manure. And the third very big area globally is around methane emissions in rice, which you can control through irrigation management. So it's my point there is that for many of these, we have affordable technical solutions, and a lot of it then is the government thinking through providing the right incentives to farmers to implement them.
And in Britain we don't do that. We think it's everyone else's problem. I think the point of this, your committee report, if I may say so, is you've got to say it's Britain's problem too. We haven't got an agricultural extension service anymore, for example. China does, India does, Britain doesn't. It's pathetic.
Okay.
I was going to add to that in that we can model what that would look like for the UK in that global system. And we know where we are now because we've got the data to be able to do that, which says we know what the gap is. So if we were to look at the gap and say, how do we get from here to here? My view on that is that you would incentivise both ends of that chain. So you would incentivise the producers and you would incentivise the consumers. But you'd also analyse what the risks are to that plan. And it goes back to the earlier point that was made around fruit and veg consumption. Our biggest trade gap is in fruit and vegetables. It's 9 billion. And the only thing that comes close is then red meat after that. Yeah. But if you were to say what is the biggest risk to that plan, it is our horticulture system, and the fact that it is very vulnerable to climate change, and particularly in southern Spain, where we get a lot of things from, and the technology exists to be able to produce those products in a closed environment and controlled environment that has lots of upside. in terms of food waste, shelf life of the product, etc., etc. So for me, I wouldn't look at the question of whether we need to be more self-sufficient to be resilient. I would look at where are the risks to us achieving a sustainable, healthy future, where we're all eating the right things. This is a slightly different lens on the same topic.
Okay. Mr. Bennett.
I think I was brought up as animal feed expert. I spent quite a lot of time looking at animal feed. That's not within my current role this year. It is a bit of a shame, Tim, in some ways from the Lancet, that actually the animal feed question, which is absolutely critical and that we should be looking at, was kicked into the appendix. Yeah. He actually had to say to me, look at page 24 of it. And I actually think it's by far one of the most critical areas we should be looking at as we take the Lancet forward in terms of feed. The livestock on leftovers is a very interesting concept. It would support some of the best agriculture and the better meat of what we're doing here. And some of the projections and some of the discussion we've had this morning around whether it's aquaculture or the growth of broiler is all dependent on this imported feedstock, which is neither resilient or sustainable going forward. So I would encourage us to sort of be razor focused on what we feed animals into the future.
Okay. Often a large amount of our food in this country is produced in climate vulnerable countries. So what responsibility do you feel that the food industry has towards those countries in how they actually provide us with the produce?
I think a huge responsibility. So we would look at what we would call vulnerable areas.
In terms of what?
It could be a number of things. It could be around social communities. It could be around equitable value chains. It could be around water. And water's a good one because we would then look at what kind of interventions would help. So, for example, been hugely documented over the years, the areas around Lake Naivasha in Kenya, where the levels in the lake go up and down, all sorts of challenges. That required a stewardship approach from all stakeholders, including the UK and Dutch governments. And a good example of where we would work collaboratively with normally our competitors to deal with those challenges, and that would be everything from water abstraction licenses and the management of that. It would be from what's going on with forestry in the upper catchment areas, what's going on with fishing in the lake itself versus, you know, an investment that we had from BBSRC in how we can grow crops, more crop per drop, how we can grow crops with less water. So there are lots of ways that we can do that, and we do have a responsibility to do that. I think the stewardship approach, and it's not just abroad, it's in this country too, is something that at the moment is very hit and miss. And if there was to be some kind of incentive to work more collaboratively on those things across all sectors, it comes back to that multifactorial approach. That would be helpful because these things are rarely simple and they're rarely single issue.
I'd just like to add a point of clarification from the first panel. Kerry McCarthy, you raised, this is in relation to your question, there was a discussion about the allocation of emissions across producer and consumer countries, and the answer from the panel is that life cycle analysis, which is the scientific method, includes both of those. What they didn't mention, though, is that so almost any scientific paper you read from people like us is using a life cycle assessment, and so we will include the full life cycle of the product right down to how it's used in people's homes. However, that is not what the political mechanism does. And so the bulk of any particular food's emissions footprint will be in agriculture. That will tend to be, for most products, around 70% or so of its footprint. And politically, that is, as you were guessing, allocated to the producer country. So, you know, beef produced in Brazil we allocate that there. So this comes back to your question: is the global political mechanism around climate at the moment doesn't lend itself very well to consumer countries working closely with the places that they're sourcing their food from to solve those together.
Carbon budgets, and we're looking at how we can meet our targets.
Yes.
We wouldn't be taking into account where the livestock feed's coming from.
Exactly.
Which is kind of a pretty big emission because it's a major part of the footprint.
Britain has
So the more food we import, the lower our footprint could be, but actually we're not. Yeah.
And that's tended to be the British policy approach to carbon reduction. We've offshored it. We've got other people to do our dirty work. And that actually has to stop. And in a sense, it's not Judith's responsibility, but the food industry is acutely aware now that consumers really are in complete lack of knowledge about this enormous footprint that we have in how we eat. I mean, you know that as well. Somehow that connection's got to be brought home so that we aren't in this fool's paradise of eating in a way that undermines our own children's futures.
Because it's the biodiversity as well as the carbon footprint, isn't it? The biodiversity loss.
Well, and I mean, Sonia, rightly has said about LCAs in the previous panel, life cycle analysis and assessment. We haven't got that on biodiversity included. What we don't need, what people like me as a mere policy analyst want, we want multi-criteria indicators which can be brought in to analysing what is a good diet. All of us have done work on little bits here and there. What we're now saying, what the Eat Lancet report I think really is a useful contribution, it moves it forward and brings in more integration on certainly the environment side. Well, it's not what we didn't do on the Eat Lancet, I really want to be clear about that. We didn't include the social dimension so much, and actually that's critical. The cultural dimension of food is absolutely critical. People don't go out looking for environment when they eat. Well, actually, few of us do, but not many. They go and get what they want, and they go and get what the price dictates, or what their grannies taught them, or if they had a heart attack, or if they've had a baby, they change. And those big processes of change have got to accelerate very fast, bringing consumers in. And we're not good at that. And your question, Dr. Offord, about behaviour change earlier, half an hour ago or so, is absolutely spot on. But what I think all of us are saying, all scientists and all policy analysts are saying now, well, we've got to include all the approaches, not just leave it to something that's put on a label by Judith's colleagues that you can't read, and you know, what's the average time someone looks at a label, Judith? It's about 6 seconds. That's actually, most studies show about 1 second. Unless you're pregnant or have had a heart attack, then people start looking. The information model doesn't work. It's very useful to have information, not least because it makes the producers and the manufacturers and the retailers declare what's in the food. But no label tells you what the biodiversity impact is. No label tells you what the embedded water in your food is. No water says how's this been grown. It's all flipped. You declare it if it's organic, not if it's been intensively grain-fed in some ghastly short life in a tin shed up the motorway, which is what the label ought to say for most meat.
Okay, we're going to move on to the final question. Anna.
Thank you. I just wanted to actually as well just welcome your comments on the Future Generations Act in Wales, because I think working together is something that we should learn from Wales. My life before becoming an MP, I worked on that in Welsh Government and helped bring it to fruition. But it is so important that we are looking at across the board on legislation to help prevent a lot of the things we're discussing at the moment. So your comments on that, very welcome. But just moving back to diets and sustainable and healthy diet recommendations, which typically propose substantial reductions in the consumption of food and animal origin, so meat, eggs, dairy, etc. And mainly because of the disproportionate environmental footprint of animal production systems. What do you think is the consequence of this on farming?
Well, I'd like to start with a clarification there of how we went about it. The Eat Lancet is we started with health, and so the diet that you read there is specified purely on health grounds. There is no environmental consideration within that. We would potentially reduce the animal products even lower if that's what we brought in. So, yeah, just to make that clear, that's a health-based diet that we then tested against environmental parameters. Okay. Impacts on livestock farming, I haven't gone into this. I would... I'm going to pass that one.
Well, where do we start? The impacts are enormous across a whole range of indicators. The critical issue is, what do we want from our land? It becomes a land use issue, actually.
Exactly.
I mean, you're asking a huge question. Do you really want us to spend all our time on that? I mean, in very short terms, we've
it's
got...
a lot of what EU policy was set up to do with the CAP 1, CAP 2, and the pillars there, which I know we're trying to frame it in such a way that it would be more environmentally beneficial and land use would be looked at. But it would be interesting to hear your view.
Well, in terms of pasture-fed meat and that kind of land use, I mean, that currently supplies a very small percentage, I don't have the figures to hand, but less than 10% of what we eat globally. So I believe that if we wanted to continue those land uses, and particularly in Europe, and favoured them through policy, it needn't have any impact at all on those kinds of farmers. What we would be looking at would be impacts on the kind of the big intensive feeding operations that are fed on crops.
Right. Okay.
And yet economically the pressures are for the latter rather than the former. That's the political economy problem we've got.
If the consumption of meat or meat-based products goes down, surely that puts farmers at risk.
Yes.
Well, it depends what farming does. You know, I mean, the good thing about Mr. Gove's agriculture bill, because it's not an act yet, is that it is saying let's pay farmers and encourage farming to be about ecosystems and benign land management. That's great, but it's severed policy from food production. So if one is sceptical, perish the thought a professor is sceptical, one could say that there's a tacit policy emerging in England. Wales is different, Scotland is different, but England's quite powerful. In England, to actually prettify the landscape and get others to feed us. I'm pushing it a bit, but there is a very strong view within Parliament of that, and certainly is a strong view from outside. And there's a very attractive model to be presented to consumers, saying, well, we'll get West Africa to provide us with cheaper food, or the US to provide us with cheaper food, or to bring, 4 chickens for £5 from Brazil, where you can get it done with very low environmental standards. And how can you inspect it? Not even mighty Sainsbury, Asda merged with Tesco, could have this inspectorate in, or the satellites of such sophistication to check what everyone in Brazil is doing rearing poultry. It's just not feasible, which is the cultural argument for bioregionalism, actually. You can see it. It's there. It's inspectable, as General Eisenhower memorably said in one of his interventions in policy, the uninspected quickly deteriorates. That applies in food, very definitely. If you can't inspect something and you can't measure it, you're not going to be able to improve it. And that's what we've got to do on all of this.
Judy, I was going to say, it just comes back to the transition point to say, how do you move to a system that we want to see? And I would like to think that it does include food production in this country.
Me too.
Because I think it is possible, but it has to be done very intelligently and in a well-informed way. And at the moment, we don't have the protocols in place for reporting to do that.
Yeah.
We certainly don't have the definitions. So, for example, if you were to ask our customers, what they understand by grass-fed or pasture-fed, there is no standard definition of those things, so anyone can put that on a label. It's not controlled just as outdoor bred, outdoor reared in pork is a real mess and confusion. We have to get those definitions and those standards very well defined, and we have to get the reporting protocols that sit behind them commonplace, and then we can start that transition. But without that, it'll just be wishful thinking.
Yeah, okay. I agree. I would just echo that, and I think that's a conversation that government needs to hold and lead. And I think there's a combination of I think one of the tensions at the moment, and you can see it from my inbox, is there isn't a proper conversation going on across the farming community on that transition. There isn't proper definitions. We have some clear ideas of what we think better meat looks like, and that sort of labelling and definition and vision of where we want to get to and how we get the right support mechanisms needs to happen. It feels like the moment now. Eat Lancet, IPCC report. I can send you another dozen reports over the last 6 months that I can't keep up with. So, but that needs to be held by government, not necessarily the private sector or NGOs.
And less attention on meat, much more attention on plant production. That's all the meat, meat takes too much time from us actually. The good news is plant growth. Last week I talked to 300 at the British Growers Association, Peterborough, halfway up to your constituency. This is an industry that turns over £2.25 billion, and it has no subsidy and no support, and government is removing its pickers, basically. Roboticisation, automation, it's 15 years down the line. We've got to have a sustainable horticulture policy very fast indeed, because every country needs to. That's the good news. Meat is taking too much of our policy attention. Let's have more attention on the positive news. Here we are, not far from Kent. My grandmother was from Kent. I was brought up eating Kent cob nuts. It's collapsed. The big news from Eat Lancet was to 50-60% increase of seeds and nuts.
Cob nuts.
Cob nuts.
Cob nuts are the way
forward. Let's send food policy nuts.
Okay, we're going to have to send ourselves off to lunch. That's been a fantastic session. Thank you all very much indeed. Order.
Ended. The proceeding has ended.